Agreed. No, I understand. I always tell people you're looking to write something beyond the box score. You're looking for something that is going to include a lot of quotes, and maybe you can touch on some highlights or key points from the game, but you're trying to find something that maybe not only is a milestone reached in the game, but for example, if someone scored 21 points on their 21st birthday, that's a great angle that you might not only know if, or you might only know if you look at the game notes or during a post-game press conference when you're talking to the reporter or coach and they provide that information. Maybe you look on their social, maybe you follow them on social media and you see their posts. So you do kind of the exploratory work around there, looking for those interesting, unique talking points that will set you aside from any other publication that's going to cover it. And when you reference the feature story angle, I always call that the Tom Rinaldi piece when I say that when I'm looking for ways to cover our athletes or look for ideas to pitch to local, regional, or national media outlets, those human interest stories, again, what I always call the Tom Rinaldi piece, they're always looking for that because places will eat that up. It's a unique story that, depending on the outlet, especially if it's a local outlet, might be of interest to the predominant viewership or readership that is following the publication of that outlet. So if you have, especially if you have a player that came out of Rockbridge or Elias or Tolton or Hickman or Battle, for example, that kind of sells itself just because a lot of times people from the area will grow up seeing those people in highlights. But if there's another player that has some kind of other unique story that's worth telling, how can you get that? How can you get that information out? And that's what I try to do as well.
And we, there's a skill to it, there's an art to it, maybe even a science to it. But because we're dealing with, at the Missourian, we're dealing with students, they're student reporters. Sometimes they need to come to the realization that this isn't a job that depends on, being in a press box all the time. Mm-hmm. The best stories are when you notice things around you, and when you are talking to people who aren't other reporters. And I love it when our reporters will go sit in stands and listen to what's being said, or find an athlete's parents and go sit with them, and you find out those sorts of backstories that make for really, really, really interesting content that way. And that, to me, is sort of a key to success in the industry, especially at this level, but also going forward. I mean, those are the kinds of stories that you used to read in Sports Illustrated, still do to a certain extent, but maybe not so much. ESPN, the magazine, those are the kinds of stories that people pay attention to, and you often don't get those stories from sitting up in a press box and reading a stats sheet. So yeah, that's what we tell our people.
Well, that's compelling journalism, and I think that's what ESPN initially built its popularity on, was going the extra mile to find those stories. You referenced earlier your time at ESPN. Who are some of those reporters at ESPN that you had the privilege of working with, and how have they helped your students or maybe some of your former students in the field today?
That's a really easy question to answer, and it's because of the University of Missouri School of Journalism is what it is. You've heard of the Missouri Mafia. It's a real thing. There's an incredible network of alums from Missouri who are at the top of the game, at the top of the industry. I can start with Wright Thompson, a Mizzou alum. I hired him at ESPN to come in and tell his stories, and He has been someone who is very interested in giving back to the J School at Mizzou. So he comes back regularly. He speaks to students. Um, there are, the Joan Neesons of the world from sports. She was at Sports Illustrated. She's now freelancing. A Mizzou alum. Um, Pat Forty, a Mizzou alum, now at Sports Illustrated. All of these people, Joan was not at ESPN, but Pat and Ray Thompson were. Seth Wickersham is still at ESPN, a Mizzou alum. These are the best sports writers, not only in the country, I think, but in the world. And it's just an incredibly rich resource for the J School at Mizzou to have. I was fortunate enough to have been in the business long enough to have met these people before I came to Mizzou, so I had networked with them already and knew them. But if you'll allow me to step outside the Missouri connection for a moment, I spent some time working with Jamel Hill when she was at ESPN. Fascinating. A woman named Jeanette Howard, who spent a lot of time at Sports Illustrated and the Washington Post and Newsday, and I met her when we worked together at the National Sports Daily. Well, the list could go on and on and on. Bomani Jones at ESPN. I hired Bomani at ESPN. Scoop Jackson out of Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
Another incredibly talented, multi-platform sports journalist who is one of the smartest people I've ever been around. It's just been a joy to work in places where that kind of talent is a daily occurrence. I used to say when I started at ESPN back in 2003, I think it was, that you just get caught up in the flow of the energy of just the incredible number of smart people that are there. And it was a place, I can't speak to it now, but it was a place back then where nobody said no. If you had an idea for a story or a project or a series, nobody ever said no. They said, give it a try, go for it. And that was just an incredibly invigorating atmosphere.
The female journalists that you just mentioned that you had the privilege of working with, what do you think makes them great in this field?
They're thinkers, but I'm not separating them from the male journalists.
Correct.
They're
yeah.
thinkers, they're smart people. They have analytical minds. They're opinionated. They're passionate. They can write. They can put sentences together. They understand the structure of the story. They know how to hook a reader into a story. They know sports. Jeanette Howard covered the NBA for a long time. She covered the Detroit Pistons during the Bad Boys era. And she was just a font of information and stories about the Rodmans of the world and the Isaiah Thomases. It's getting her talking about the Pistons back in those days is, you could spend 5 days just having a conversation with Jeanette about the Pistons. Passionate, talented, dedicated, but ESPN was chock full of those kinds of people, and it was just you get swept along with it.
With The Last Dance being so popular as it was over the last couple of months, were you able to have conversations with her at all, especially when the part about the Detroit Pistons was featured in The Last Dance?
I haven't talked to Jeanette for it's been way too long. It's probably been 5 or 6 months since I talked with her, but no. So the answer is no, I did not talk with her about The Last Dance.
Well, I discovered an interesting fact that John Paxson's wife is actually a Stevens alumna.
How about that?
Yeah, so Tony Hyde, who's their senior director of corporate marketing. I think that's his title, something along those lines. He was actually able to share some photos of her and the family during key moments in the Bulls history. Either I think one was from when John was introduced as the GM. Another one was when they were having a Mother's Day. I guess it was all the players' mothers from one year that were at the court. So that was, perfect timing considering Mother's Day and one of the two airings of The Last Dance fell on a Sunday on a Mother's Day. So it gave me a reason to use that photo. And you're right, there are just a lot of local connections that are interesting to learn about, whether it's in sports journalism or just, I don't believe in 6 degrees of separation. I think there's one, because the amount of people that have come out of Stevens, especially in the TV and film industry. Stephanie Beatrice played in the Celebrity All-Star Game for Major League Baseball a couple years ago, or I guess maybe it was last year when it was at the Cleveland Indians home field. So you're right. It's pretty interesting when you see her being interviewed on Sports Illustrated, and it might have been someone that you're friends with, and she has the connection back here. And there are just so many local connections that make the world of sports journalism, just the world of sports, a lot of fun in this area. I know you and I talked a little bit off air about Scott Van Pelt, just because, one of the reasons I got into broadcast journalism and working in sports media was because I was that kid who grew up watching SportsCenter all the time. I was watching Dan Patrick and Stuart Scott and Keith Olbermann and all these other people that were kind of, to me, larger than life. With you, I think you said that you had never met Scott in person, right? With the exception of like maybe dealing with him in the gym a little bit.
Yeah, we see him at the gym when we were both working out.
I watch his show every night. I was like, I have to ask, was there any weight on the end of those bench presses or something? Because
so here's let me go back. As long as we're talking about Van Pelt, I don't have a story about it, but I was talking earlier about sort of allowing your own fandom to show through in your work as sort of a fairly recent, we're talking long term, we're talking big picture here, so 20 years ago, a reasonably recent development in sports journalism, allowing your fandom to show through. And Van Pelt does that. He's one of those people who is not shy about letting you know that he went to the University of Maryland, that he's a Terrapins fan. That clearly comes through, and I think people relate to that. The Greeny and Golick radio show on ESPN Radio, those guys, made a living out of being fans. Greenberg went to Northwestern. He was never shy about touting Northwestern, my alma mater.
Stephen Colbert too.
So those are they're broadcast equivalents of the Bill Simmons story I was telling about at ESPN.com. So and that was another fun thing about ESPN, because they encourage them. They're all about the fan. That's how they make their money. They want to make sure that they are reaching out to fans. They're engaging fans. That's why up until recently they were in the 95 to 105 million subscribers to the cable service, because they catered to the fan. And that was one way they did it. They encouraged it, and I appreciated that.